Well, hello everybody, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, Roger Barber, who's the author of a new book, Jack the Ripper, Dissecting the Truth. And this book takes a slightly different angle on the mystery than other books do, and then it looks at psychological profiling to build up a picture of the murderer or the Whitechapel murderer. So first of all, hello, Roger.
Hello, Richard. I had to think about that one for a minute.
I'm, I'm always having to think about it. It comes to us all in time.
I know.
Your book's basically about you wanted to use psychological profiling to build up this picture, this image of what the murderer's like. You didn't want to write a book that was basically a whodunit, that was this was the person Jack the Ripper was. You wanted to sort of do the psychological profile element of it, if I'm correct on that.
Yes, I think the problem is that there are so little facts that we know for certain about the murders and the circumstances, and a picture has been built up over the years of this sort of fictitious figure called Jack the Ripper, with the cape and the bag and the hat and all this stuff and the fog and all that, which to me, I wanted to get away from that and really concentrate on the real killer and what his motive was, because you don't just go around, you might be a serial killer killing random victims, but they don't normally basically take apart their bodies. There's got to be a reason for that. And that's what I was trying to investigate, the reason behind why he was doing what he was doing.
And did you come to any conclusions? Or?
Yeah, I did. But it sort of goes back to when I first started researching it. I determined to not to take any preconceived ideas, but to start with a blank piece of paper, which was quite difficult because there are so few facts that you can use. So I went back to the newspaper reports at the time and the coroner's inquests and other source material that was available that we can definitely say was accurate. In doing so, I made a whole load of notes from newspaper cuttings, etc. And that's when I found someone quite interesting, which I then followed up to over the years. I actually did an article in the Criminologist magazine, which was published, but that was 30 years ago, and Stuart Evans knew all about it, obviously. And when I retired a couple of years ago, I thought I really need to try and follow this up, find some more information, and ultimately do a book, which I've done.
So it was a raced through project. It took just a mere 30 years.
Yeah, it started 30 years ago, yeah. And it did then end up in the A to Z of Jack the Ripper, which I'm in there. But they got something wrong there. They actually said that I trawled the suicides at the time to find this guy, and I didn't. This was a newspaper report that said that someone aged 40 had committed suicide. And when I investigated further into another newspaper, an East End Gazette, I think it was, it said that he was actually aged 30, and they got his name right this time, which was Edward Buchan. And it started to make me think. So I then got hold of his death certificate and his birth certificate and discovered that he killed himself on his birthday, which I felt was highly significant. And it was a week after the Kelly murder, and it was on the day of her funeral. Interestingly, the funeral procession went through the East End almost on his doorstep on that same day. And what I put forward in my original article, it may have been the thing that pushed him over the edge, because in effect, he was a nobody. He achieved nothing by doing these murders. And in fact, Mary Kelly was now the star of the show, if you like, even though she was deceased. She'd become a personality in her own right, and he was still nowhere. You know, he obviously had low self-esteem. And basically, I thought that may have just tipped him over the edge.
So how did you become interested in the Whitechapel murders? Where did your interest begin? I'm always fascinated by this, because how people became interested in them.
I read the Stephen Knight book, like most people, I think. I hadn't read any of the previous books on the subject. The Stephen Knight book was obviously highly entertaining and sort of grabbed my attention. and obviously it was all about the Masonic plots and all this stuff, but it gave you a good background about the murders themselves. And I was just intrigued because I thought it's a great thing to actually solve something that has been unsolved for 130 odd years. But obviously, I know that, like Stuart says, we're never going to know exactly. And I think you think the same. We'll never know exactly who it was. So the aim really is to put forward a premise about a suspect who really hasn't been taken seriously at all. It did in the early stages when I first wrote the article. As a few people said, we need to follow this guy up, and no one ever has, which I find rather strange. Because, as I say, it's the psychological profile of this guy, and there's more to it as well, which I'll share with you, indicates he could have well have been the killer.
They often say that that the killer had surgical or medical knowledge. Did he have any? Or?
I don't believe it was. I don't believe that's the case, because if you read the coroner's inquest or the inquest for the doctor's reports, it was just a wild, frenzied attack. I mean, he was slashing around. The legs got slashed. Parts of the body got slashed. In effect, all he was doing, he knew roughly where the things were he wanted to take out, and ripped it so he could actually get in there to do it, and then just took everything out. And the psychology behind it, which people like Colin Wilson came up with in the first place, for example, was that it showed a suicidal tendency because he was aiming for the wound. So it was where he came from. There's a psychological reason for taking out reproductive organs out of these ladies, because he either hated himself or he hated his mother, had a dominating mother, or both. Edward Buchan had both. I'll get to the mother if you want to hear about that as well. But there is a reason why he was doing what he was doing. So if you want some background information about him, he was 29 on his birthday in 1888. He was born in 1859. He lived at home with his mother and father in a shop. He was single. He had brothers and sisters. He had one sister who lived with him. And he had access to knives because he also was a part-time shoemaker. He had a little place out the back of the shop where he mended shoes. So he had shoemaker's knives. And I think in one of the coroner's, or one of the inquests, it did mention a knife that was about the same length as a shoemaker's knife, a narrow blade and a point at the end. I think that sort of fitted. But I have also recently I found some information about his sister, who ended up in an asylum, and I read her asylum notes, and it said that she'd attacked the mother, which is the same mother I believe he had the problem with. So there's something going on there.
And you say he was a shoemaker, so he had shoemaker's knives, etc.
Part time, yes.
Yeah. Do you think he could have been Leather Apron?
I don't think Leather Apron exists. I mean, Leather Apron was John Pizer. That's it. There was no other. I mean, it was proved it wasn't him. He had an alibi. And I had this conversation with Martin Fido when I first did my article, and Martin Fido was talking to me on the phone, and as soon as I mentioned this guy and the shoemaker, he said, Leather Apron. And I thought, well, why? I couldn't quite understand that. And I think this is just one example of all the things and the myths and the misinformation there is about the murders, where people draw conclusions based on false information. I really do.
But the prostitutes were definitely talking about somebody who was extorting them, who was being violent towards them and threatening towards them. And so could that have been him?
I think it could have been Pizer myself. I think it was him who was probably trying to do all that stuff. And I think we don't need to look any further than John Pizer as the identity of Leather Apron. Obviously, the Star newspaper you mentioned are obviously responsible for coming up with Jack the Ripper, the name in the first place, as has been proved. I think absolutely. I think when I spoke to Stuart Evans, he's got a different person that he thinks was the journalist who did it. But there's a very good YouTube video which shows about the handwriting of Fred Best, who was a journalist on there, and it's actually on YouTube. I thought it was very good because they actually got a handwriting expert to compare his handwritten notes for his will, handwritten will, with the writing on the Dear Boss letter. Overlapped it. It was identical. So I think it was Frederick Best. But they both worked on the same. It was the same idea. So this is why I wanted to get away from anything to do really in a way, although I called the book Jack the Ripper, to get away from that, to really get back to basics almost, and to throw out, because most of the books that are written, there's hundreds of books written, just go over the same people again and disproving other people's theories. I've tried not to do that, I've included a couple of little bits in it, but I haven't done what most people do, just regurgitating the same suspects. These are the ones that it could have been, and because I don't think any of them are right. I really don't.
I'm inclined to agree with you there. That my personal belief is he's not yet on any list of suspects,
No.
or the well trotted out ones. But as I said, given the interview we're having, I'll say he's not yet on that.
No. Well, I hope he is. I mean, that's the purpose of the exercise. Even the purpose of the book is not to sell lots and lots of copies of the book. It's to actually get him into the domain, if you like, so that people can discuss it. And I'd obviously encourage people to do more research into the same guy, because I think it could be very fruitful.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head there as well, in that my belief's always been that we need to separate the Whitechapel murderer from Jack the Ripper, because Jack the Ripper is this fictitious character, whereas the Whitechapel murderer is the real murderer.
Yeah, and was probably a very ordinary person. I mean, I'm not saying he was ordinary in the head, but he would have been an ordinary person to people who saw him. I think the other thing, excuse me, it's important, I think, is that he was a sociopath, which means he couldn't have relationships with women. And I think he selected his victims on a random basis, and knowing that prostitutes frequented that area early hours of the morning, they were easy targets for him to get to. And there's that leads to something I put in the book about the double event, because I don't think anyone has ever suggested this before, that Elizabeth Stride actually had a coffee shop in Poplar. We know that for a fact, with her husband, with John Thomas Stride. And Edward Buchan would have been about 15 or 16 at the time, and he literally lived 100 yards away from their coffee shop. And I think what happened was when he attacked Elizabeth Stride from behind, cut her throat, turned her over and recognised her. And because his whole psychological emphasis was on people he didn't know, he didn't want to have a relationship with the victims, I think it freaked him out. And that's why he ran off to find somebody else. I don't think it was to do him being disturbed. I think he was disturbed in a different way, but he wasn't disturbed physically. He was disturbed mentally. So I've no one's ever put that forward, and I think it makes a lot of sense that he couldn't bring himself to do what he did with the other victims.
But do you think that he's the man then? Israel Schwartz said that he saw the woman being attacked in the gateway. What do you think of that?
I don't know. It's all about timing, isn't it? I've never really, and there's a lot of people aren't that convinced that Israel Schwartz is a reliable witness. I don't know. I mean, the Lipsky thing was obviously aimed at him. Somebody was saying, "Yeah, watch out! There's a Jewish guy over the road." But no, I don't know. Is the answer? The other angle, of course, is that he could well have. Because some of the police, I think it was a police scene, was it William Smith, saw her with someone who gave a description of it, of him. The other thing that I've suggested in the book is that some of the witnesses said that the person they saw with a couple of victims was dressed like a sailor. And Edward Buchan worked in his father's marine stores shop in Poplar. And if you know anything about marine stores, what they did when the sailors got off their ships in the docks, East London docks, they would go to these marine stores and they would sell off all their equipment and clothes. So he would again have access to dress like a sailor or dress however he wanted, and it was obviously to throw people off of who he was. and he could well have been doing that as well. So that's very relevant. The other thing about him, which is again I've been looking at, is that they in the marine stores, and I've got a photo in the book of a marine outside a marine store's shop. They had hand carts, all have the horse and cart, and every morning they used to drive into the Whitechapel Road, to do their business, buy and sell. And it was around the same time. It'd be 4 o'clock in the morning. He'd be driving in and out of Whitechapel. So my argument is, when he killed the victims, he could well have just left his cart around the corner, or there were stables in a couple of the sites as well, where he could have left the cart in there, picked the car up and out, and the streets of Whitechapel, Whitechapel Road, at 4 or 5 in the morning was absolutely heaving with all sorts of vehicles you see in the photos. So he could very well easily have escaped. While the police were searching in the immediate area, he was well gone. And I think that's maybe how he got away with it.
I think that's a very important point, because a lot of people, when they picture it, they think Whitechapel Road, it's going to be deserted. But we had markets galore around there. You had the Haymarket on Whitechapel High Street. You had the slaughterhouses. You had the Spitalfields Market. All that produce coming into the East End of London along Whitechapel Road. So, as you say, it would have been a busy, heaving road. And I think the coroner made that point at Mary Nichols's inquest. That is, all he has to do is get out onto Whitechapel Road, and he can lose himself in the morning crowd.
That's right, which I'm sure that's what he did, and that's why I believe it makes, because there's always the connection with Whitechapel, which is a different one. Now, his eldest brother married someone who had relatives in George Yard, which was interesting. So there is a sort of link there. I'm not saying that's 100% proven, because I haven't done any background about the family too much, but it was the same family name, and they were actually living in George Yard at the time. But I think it's more about the business, that he was going in to do business, and it was the obvious place to go to do business was Whitechapel. And on his in the newspaper report of his death, it actually said that his family said he'd been acting in a very strange manner for the last 2 months, which is the period of the murders, which is interesting. And another thing to add to that, I did a little bit onto his family tree to see his background, and I found a family tree on Ancestry that he was on, and the person who put it on had put Edward in brackets the Ripper Buchan on their family tree. So I contacted this person and said, well, why have you done that? And he said, because the family thought it was him at the time. And I got goosebumps at this point. So
I can imagine.
So they're all strands. I mean, they're all lots and lots of strands that come together that make him a viable suspect, that's what I'm going to say. Just finally, the other thing that is, I don't know if you know, I think you've covered it actually, in Miller's Court, about a year after there was an American came to view the scene. It was a visitor. Do you remember that?
Yes, indeed, yeah.
And the old crone and the bed and the blood and everything, and they had to pay £1 or whatever it was, and she said, oh, come and look at the writing on the wall. And the writing on the wall said 51. Do you remember that?
Yes, yeah.
Which doesn't make a lot of sense, except bear in mind that Edward Buchan apparently had a problem with his mother. His mother married his father in 1851. I know, it's very circumstantial and what have you, but it does make a slight bit of sense about why he would put 51 on there. It certainly wasn't 51 murders he was going to do.
So what do we know about his relationship with his mother then?
Well, he basically, his mother obviously was a bit of a problem, because we don't know exactly on a day-to-day basis what was going on, but I've done it really more on why he would commit suicide on his birthday, which is, from a psychological point of view, means that he had low self-esteem, and there was some problem with his mother. Now, what I've done, I found about 6 months ago, I found a copy of his signature, Edward Buchan's signature, when he was a witness at his brother's wedding, about 3 years before the murders. And I got a lady called Ruth Myers, who's a top graphologist who works with the police, to do an analysis. Now, it's not ideal because obviously you've just got a signature. It's not like a full page of writing. But she came back and she didn't know who it was I was talking about. And she said he had a twisted personality. He had a dominating mother. I mean, it was unbelievable from this, and low self-esteem, which all fitted with what I was trying to suggest. So it's just another thing to add to it. It's not, again, none of it is basically is concrete evidence, but then nothing is. You've just got to try and build a picture. So yeah, that's where I am with it.
There's no concrete evidence against any suspect, and I think
No.
all the suspects that come forward, I think they're all, when people bring up a suspect, when they've done, like you have, research into it, I think everybody brings something to the table. They bring something new into it, that, like you say, you start pulling at those strands, and because the one thing we haven't got today is we haven't got any concrete evidence. We haven't got the police evidence. We don't know. We know they had suspects, but we don't know why they had those suspects. So really, we just have what we can find in the newspapers, whatever.
Well, that's right. I've covered the police actually in one of the chapters, and I was saying that actually when you go through it, none of them had a clue who it was. They all came up with different people. They're all arguing amongst themselves as to who they thought it was. I mean, some of them changed their suspects a number of times, including Aberline. He was after George. I forgot his name now.
George Chapman,
George Chapman, and then Druitt, and talking about Druitt, I can't see any reason whatsoever why Druitt is in the frame at all, because he committed suicide by throwing himself in the Thames and with rocks in his pocket because he'd just been sacked from the school where he worked, presumably, and we don't know, for something to do with the boys. He was probably homosexual. And he threw himself in the river I think it was about 5 or 6 weeks after the Kelly murder. So there's no evidence whatsoever, apart from I think his uncle was a surgeon. But there's nothing else. So I don't know. They just seem to put random people in the frame to say, we're doing a job. We're trying to find this guy.
That was McNaughton, wasn't it? Because that's McNaughton saying that he, from private correspondence or private talking with the family, he seems to think his own family thought he was Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, but I mean, I put on the back of the book, I've actually said Major Henry Smith, Acting Commissioner of the City of London Police. It completely beats me in every police officer in London. I have no more idea now where he lived than I had 20 years ago. Detective Inspector Edmund Reed, which we know about, I challenge anyone to produce a tittle of evidence of any kind against any suspect. The earth has been raked over and the sea has been to find this criminal Jack the Ripper, always without success. It still amazes me to read the writings of such men as Dr. Anderson and many others, all holding different theories, but all of them wrong. I have answered many of them in print and would only add here that I was on the scene and I ought to know. So, the guy who was on the scene at the time is saying, we haven't got a clue. None of us. So you completely ignore anything that the police came up with in the way of suspects, because they say themselves they're wrong. They don't know.
Well, I think Anderson's interesting because, of course, he wasn't even. He went on holiday, or he went on a recuperative break just as the murders were beginning.
Yes,
and then doesn't come back until till October. And I think, and of course, then later on, he's writing. And what I always say to people about the police memoirs, because they're all talking in their memoir. Well, he's talking in his memoirs, and of course, if you've been working on the case and you go, I'm going to write my memoirs. I've got this. I think it's, well, who was he then? And you can't. Well, actually, I don't know. Because the publisher's going to, well, I'm not interested in that. If you don't know, I'm not interested. And of course, the other point about Anderson is that Jack the Ripper is only a very small part of his memoir. A lot of people think the whole memoir is about Jack or the Whitechapel murders.
Yeah, I've got a copy of it. Yeah, that's right.
It's a brief mention. It's not. Most of it's about his espionage work.
That's right. Yeah, I mean the other ones who have been put forward. I mean, I have been looking with great interest at the huge number of videos on there about Charles Lechmere. And I have mentioned it in the book that the silly thing about Charles Cross was Charles Cross when he worked at Pickford's. He called himself Charles Cross because his stepfather was a policeman. In order to secure the job, which was difficult in those days to secure a job, he obviously used his father's name in order to get the job. So he was always Charles Lacrosse as far as Pickfords were concerned. And in fact, there was an accident which you've covered on here, if not about 15 years before. And he clearly said he was Charles Cross, Carman for Pickfords, and he was called Charles Cross. The only times, all the other times he called himself Lechmere was when it was an official document, like a census or anything official. He called himself by his name, Charles Lechmere, his birth name. But as far as that, so I don't see any evidence whatsoever he was trying to hide anything. It's just, again. And the other thing against it, I know I do. I mean, I shouldn't really be saying, but I mean, anyone who fathers 9 children is not going to be a murderer of prostitutes in Whitechapel. I think it's the whole point was that why he was doing it is because he couldn't. He was impotent. He couldn't have sex with them, and so that cuts him and a lot of others out completely. But the other thing, I don't know if you wanted to know about that. I did some research very quickly on George Hutchinson, and I believe I've identified George Hutchinson for the first time ever.
Oh, fantastic.
Very easily, because George Hutchinson made a statement to the police saying he used to be a groom. So all I did, because I do family history, I looked up the 1881 census and typed in George Hutchinson groom, and I found him. And he came from Durham, and he was a groom and a servant to a surgeon. Now, this was going to cause a bit of interest to the Hutchinson fans, because he worked for a surgeon. And he was sacked from his job, and he came to London, as far as I can see, to get work. If you remember, like George Hutchinson was looking for work, and he was unemployed, and he went back. So in 1891 census, he's back up he's actually in Hartlepool now. He married the fellow servant who worked on the place that he worked, and they had one child by that point, by 1891. So I can say with some sort of pretty sure, actually, that this is the right guy. It works. He was the right age. I think he was 30 at the time. He was 21 in 1881 anyway.
Do you think he did see what he said he saw?
No.
That's always fascinated me, because...
No, I don't. I mean, it's impossible. The lighting wouldn't have been good enough to... You might see a shadow or a bit of a face. You're not going to see all that, his eyebrows. And I was looking at it earlier on. It's crazy, isn't it?
I mean, it's an incredibly detailed description.
I think he panicked because someone identified him, didn't he, as actually being across the road at the time.
Well, that's what I've always thought. I always thought that if again, we only have his word for it, that he was standing there for that 45 minutes or so. But then if he was seen by people and people were starting to describe someone they'd seen opposite, and he thought, oh, it's me. And I think that's when he panics and thinks, okay. And because that's the sort of thing I could imagine myself doing that. If you overtalk it, you overcompensate, as it were.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think if we say that was him, and there's a fair chance that was the right George Hutchinson, it does open up a bit more research for the Hutchinson fans who want to put him in the frame, because the fact he worked for a surgeon and he was sacked, and whether he stole medical equipment from there, it's something to follow up, isn't it? It could have been him. But I just don't think the psychology again with him is correct either. I think in your video, I think you said he was probably a client of Mary Kelly's. He said he'd known her for 3 years.
Yeah, I think the point I made in the video was that he said he'd known her for these years, and of course that would mean that he must have known her before she told Barnett she'd come to the East End of London.
I think that's nonsense as well. So I don't think he knew her for 3 years. He may have been a client a couple of times or whatever. I don't know why he would have been there if not. So it's another interesting thing.
Well, I also find that bit about lend sixpence or lend sixpence that when he meets her at sort of 1 o'clock in the morning on Whitechapel Road. But of course, that's the problem we have today. Is we've got all these tantalising things that are there, and we just cannot look those people in the eye and interview them. It would make it so much easier.
It would, yeah. If they knew what they'd seen anyway. I'm not convinced, but that any of the witnesses. I know that Stuart Evans is not convinced about really any of the witnesses being particularly reliable, because they're all different in what they say. I think there seems to be a thread going through, though, that some of the witnesses saying, like Lowender, for example, who I think is fairly credible witness, where he saw the killer with Eddowes, wasn't it? Yeah, and it was right. The timing seemed to be exactly right, so it probably was him. And he described him, and I think some of the witnesses, about 3 or 4 of them, said he was about 30, 5'7". I mean, my guy's 29, so that fits. The sailors thing, as I said to you, is a possibility, because he had access to that sort of stuff. Yeah, I mean, overall, it's a possibility. So at the end of the day, I'm not, as I say, saying categorically, yes, we found Jack the Ripper, but we found a guy who has a lot going for him, a lot more than some of the other people have been put forward.
Because that's what I think about Lavender as well. Because I think Lavender gives quite a detailed description of the man he sees, and then says he wouldn't be able to identify him again if he were to see. And to me, there's a slight contradiction there.
I think sometimes also, if you're a witness, you're a bit worried they're going to come and get you. You know, if I give witness against it, you don't know, do you? You're probably worried that you just don't know.
I think one of the things we tend to do today with the murders is we come at them with hindsight. So we come at them, we think, well, why didn't he do that? Yeah. Well, take Charles Cross, for example. I mean, Charles Cross and Robert Paul in Bucks Row, they're walking into history. We're looking back on history. And I've often done this myself since I've been looking at the various witnesses. When I walk down the street, how many people do I actually notice? I see a lot of people, but how many of the people I see do I notice? And how many of them would I be able to describe 3 days later if I just walked past them in the street? Even if I walked past a couple chatting on a corner, or would I be able to recall them 3 days later and describe them?
My wife and I always say that. We say when we see the crime programs on the TV, and you say, "Well, where were you last Thursday at 7 o'clock?" I haven't got a clue. I have a job to remember my own name sometimes. I don't know where I was. How can you possibly? So I agree with you. It is, and I know that Stuart Evans is very cautious about any of the witness statements, and the lighting, of course, which would have been you get the one gas lamp, and so anything within a 6-foot radius is okay, but anything beyond that, it's just pitch black, isn't it? So you need to put that in the mix as well. So yeah, it's interesting.
And I think the other thing we get is I think we get a lot of journalistic embellishment. Because we know, for example, from Mary Kelly's, when you read the accounts in Lloyd's and other newspapers after Mary Kelly's murder, when the journalists are in the street and they can't get into Miller's Court, they're chatting to the locals, and everybody knew her. Oh yeah, I knew Mary Kelly. I knew Mary Kelly. I knew Mary Kelly. I used to drink with Mary Kelly. And of course, you can just see the journalists think, oh, okay, do you want a drink? Let's go and have a drink and tell me your story. And so you can almost see that happening. And the journalist thinking, well, this is a bit dull. I'm going to spice it up a bit.
Absolutely. I did cover that, obviously, in the bit about Mary Kelly, was the fact that we actually, again, we know nothing about her. We don't know it was even her real name. We don't know that she came from Limerick. She probably did. And we definitely don't know if she got married and moved to Wales. I don't think that happened. I think that's all complete supposition. I mean, you can't, there is no evidence. I did find a baptism in Limerick, County Limerick, for Mary Kelly, which fits the right dates. But I'm not saying that was her. But also, I think she may have gone straight to the East End. And she seemed to know the area quite well. If she come up from Wales and worked in the West End, she wouldn't have done, would she?
And I think that's the problem. Again, I think there's a bit of a problem there in that looking for a Kelly in Ireland, it's a bit like looking for a Jones in Wales.
Yeah, like yours family. Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. You just have to differentiate by Jones the carter or Jones the plumber or Jones the decorator. But so anyway, shall we get back to Edward?
Yes.
When you began your research, how did you begin the research? Was it just you found him in the newspaper?
Yeah, as I say, I started off with a blank sheet of paper. I wrote down everything I found I could find that was actually said at the time in the newspapers, coroner's inquest, any other sources that you could rely on, where somebody said something about the murders. And then I went through it afterwards, and I just found this reference to this guy who, I say, originally in one of the East End papers, it said he was 40 and his name was Robert Buchan, and he was a shoemaker, which is interesting. So I went to follow that up, and I found other newspapers in the area. Another one, I think one was East End Gazette, and one was East End News, and the other one was more accurate because he said he was 30, and his name was Edward Buchan, and he was a marine stores dealer. And I've put some things in the book. There were some references to someone who could have been the killer, who had a series of marine stores around the city. So I don't know. It's all. But anyway, what happened? So I took that. Then I ordered the death certificate, which says how he killed himself. I compared that with the inquest report, and then I got his birth certificate. And then that's when I discovered that he killed himself on his birthday, which seemed highly significant to me, to why he was doing what he was doing. To me, there's only two reasons why he was taking organs out. One was to sell them, which there was a market, which I think Wim Baxter did suggest in one of his summings up.
He did at the Annie Chapman.
Because he liked to show off. Or it was for a reason, a psychological reason why he was doing it, because I just don't think that all the people who get put forward as suspects, there's no reason for them to be doing what they're doing. They've all got jobs, they've all got families, they've all got children. There's no reason. But this guy had a reason, because he's obviously a very mixed up guy. He's single, and also I mentioned about the FBI profile, which Robert Ressler did, and I think there's another guy, and they came up with some of the points that would qualify to work out who he was, the murderer. And I think there was about 12 points, and Edward Buchan answers 10 of them. So, it fits with their profile as well. So I mentioned Colin Wilson. I meant even Martin Fido said something which I've quoted as well. But they all go off into different tangents and go off in different directions. So they probably couldn't even remember what they said in the first place. So you've got to be consistent. And I think also a lot of the problem with a lot of the books that have been written, they find someone and say, we're going to build a case against this guy. Yeah, that's so they take a person they think it could have been, and they try and fit all the evidence around it. And in the case of Charles Lechmere, for example, I noticed the last video, they're trying to change all the murder date times to fit in with his way to work. It's silly things that when someone was murdered at 5 something, they say, oh no, the timing couldn't have been right because it needs to fit in with Charles Lechmere on his way to work at 3:30 or 4, and it just doesn't work for me. And I think a lot of the problem with it is the timings of the murders, because all the experts who say, well, they were murdered half an hour before or a quarter of an hour before, or it's very inaccurate, and we simply don't know. Even with the case of Mary Ann Nichols, we don't know that she wasn't murdered at 3:15. She could well have been before he got there. 3:15 to 3:30 seems to be something that a lot of people have put forward, which then eliminates Charles Lechmere because he wouldn't have left home in time. So, so this whole thing is built up with trying to fit a case around somebody. I don't think that's the right approach. I know I've done it to an extent, but only after I've sort of tried to work out the reason why he was doing what he was doing. And there's this guy that seems to fit the profile. That's a different approach entirely.
And I think with timings as well, I'm always very suspicious of timings, because I mean, even today, if I might leave the house to get to the tube each morning, but 5-10 minutes either way, I might think, well, yeah, and then I'm thinking, okay, well, this morning I left it, and I think what's nice about Charles Cross or Lechmere is he does say around 3:30, whereas Robert Paul says exactly 3:45, and I, today I think you'd be hard pushed to do it, but in those days, were clocks that accurate? And of course, we're looking back on it, and we're thinking, well, that happened, and that happened, so they must have remembered it, but they're walking into it. And and I think that's a point that needs to be constantly made. They're going into the moment. They're going into the history that we're now looking back on with 136 or so years of hindsight.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
But here endeth the lesson.
Well, I have a copy of the book here, which is actually, yeah, it's going to be delivered in the next few days from the printers. And I'm trying to work out at the moment a way of, obviously, for people to buy a copy. And so I'm setting up with Amazon, so it should be available through there. I also have a friend called Loretta Lay, who you may know. I think you do know her, don't you?
I know Loretta very well. Yep.
Met her 30 years ago when I did a book signing for Camel Wolf. And she's got her own true crime website. It's going to be available on there as well.
I'll put a link. I'll put a link down to Loretta's website in the description down below, and then people can get it through there.
Yeah.
And is the original criminologist article available online, or can people still read that?
I don't think it is. I know I saw Stuart, because I spent some time with him, as you have, and he's got this amazing collection. And he showed me a copy of it. I hadn't seen since, because I've lost mine. so
Oh, you haven't got your original article?
No, I'm sure I don't know if it's online at all, the criminologist, but yeah. So that was the first thing. And so then when it appeared in the Jack the Ripper A to Z, and then in Who's Jack the Ripper with Camel Wolf's company, which there's 100 copies at the time. I've actually got the only copy that's completely signed by everybody, because I'm a bit of a collector and I hunted them down. So,
are you as a collector to the extent that Stuart's a collector, Stuart Evans?
I don't think anyone could compete with Stuart. I mean, it's unbelievable. But he probably competes with the British Library, I should think. But obviously he's got his own theory about Tumblety, which I don't share, to be honest. I can see a lot of reasons why, but I can also see reasons why not. The fact that he was 6'2", for a start, and I think the story about him showing wombs in jars, there's no evidence to say that actually happened. It's just something that's been passed down. Oh, he did this. So I'm not convinced, and I'm also not convinced he wasn't in prison at the time, because he was actually locked up officially, but Stuart reckons he got out somehow, appealed against it, but there's no evidence again. So it's a hard one. Just finally, the case against the Duke of Clarence doesn't even start, because he was in the brothel when it got raided, homosexual, and also he was. I don't know if you know, in the Times newspaper every day, there's a court roll of where the royal family are on a given day, and the Duke of Clarence was in Balmoral on 2 of the murder dates. End of story. I know people ignore that. They say, "Oh no, he could." He couldn't. He couldn't have done on both counts. So yeah. So
I think the problem we have today is that it's almost a footballification of everyone now has to take sides. There was a time when you could discuss it and you could be, well, that's interesting, but now it's so polarized. You can't meet in the middle anymore like you used to be able to. And I think when you start losing that angle of or that element of discussion, then you can get all these theories that people want simple solutions. That's the problem we have today as well. People want simple solutions. And if somebody comes forward with a YouTube video that gives them a simple solution, well, it's obvious, then they go straight to that side. And it's the same as happened in politics, to be honest. But it's just, I can solve all your problems. I can solve the mystery of Jack the Ripper. Oh, fantastic then. I believe you.
I'm trying not to do that. I'm trying to be objective, as you are. You're always objective in your videos and what you say.
Oh, thank you.
And so is Stuart. And I think that's the right angle to take. That it's good to have different things coming into for people to discuss, but you can't dominate it by saying, "Oh, I've got it right," and you've all got it wrong. Because I'm not saying that. I'm just saying this is someone who needs to be taken seriously as a suspect, and should certainly, in my opinion, be in the top 10, if not top 3 or 4. Not nowhere in the top 100 seems a bit crazy to me, but
I shall add him to my voting list as well. So I've got a list on so people can vote for who they think Jack the Ripper was. So I'll add him to that as well. And
sorry, in answer to what you were saying about about discussion, I know that when we do this video, there's going to be a lot of reaction to it, because that's what people do, and so I'm prepared for that.
I think on the whole, people are willing to listen to new information. I think that again, it's like politics. The ones who shout loudest are the ones who get heard the most, whereas the majority of people don't shout loud. They might disagree, and they'll say they disagree, but they're not loud about it. They say, "Oh, I don't really agree with that. I think it's," but they will listen. Whereas when people are so polarized on a particular suspect, they won't listen. Everyone else is talking nonsense, and yeah, and of course, people are schooled in things like Criminal Minds and CSI, and everybody now thinks they're a detective.
And you can solve them instantly by using all different techniques and traffic cameras and all this stuff. If we had cameras at the time, it would have been great, wouldn't it? But
yeah, you can solve it in 45 minutes plus commercial breaks.
Yeah, so that's also why I mentioned George Hutchinson, because although he's not the person I think was the killer, I think at least I can add some information for people to go away with and use that to maybe build a different picture. You can't just be narrow-minded and say this is the answer. You've always got to allow for other people to have other ideas as well, and see where we end up.
Exactly, an holistic approach.
Yes.
Well, Roger, it's been fascinating talking with you. And new suspects, I always find a new suspect is fantastic to have, because A, it brings something new to the table, but B, it gives people something new to discuss as well and talk about. And of course, when people start talking about it, that's when more information can get found, and people will go off and dig into the records and come up with something that, yeah. And it's happened a few times when I've interviewed people, and they've said, "Do you know what? Someone then came forward with this, and then someone came forward with that." And I think that's the way it should be. Everybody works together. They might not agree with each other, but they work together.
Absolutely. Okay.
So thank you so much, Roger. I shall put a link to the book down below. Fascinating discussion, and have a great remainder of your day.
And thank you very much for the time to do it. That's great. Thank you. Nice to meet you. Okay. All the best.